this is me, and it's a few years ago. I didn't used to wear glasses then, but it gives you a few details about me. I don't want to waste your time on this, but this summer will be the 30th anniversary of my having joined the School of Oriental African Studies in London to teach the history of Japanese art. It's also the 40th anniversary of my first setting foot in Japan, and it will be also the 60th birthday. So a lot of things are happening in the next couple of months, and I'm delighted also to be able to share with you in this period my most recent publication, which is this book called Tokyo Before Tokyo. Now, I think some of you are registered from different parts of the world, but those of you who are members of Walk Japan, I'm sure you know a bit about Japan. And of course, you know that Tokyo is the name given to the capital of Japan from the time when it became the capital, 1868. Before then, the capital was Kyoto. In fact, Kyoto was not, properly speaking, a name. Kyoto just means the capital. It's only when Tokyo became the capital, Kyoto had to be referred to as something. So they said, okay, Kyoto will be regarded as a proper noun. Before it became the capital, there was already a town at the place that became Tokyo, and it was called Edo. My publishers thought that the word Edo was not, didn't have much name recognition, and therefore they opted for the title Tokyo Before Tokyo. But it's a book about Edo and its city planning. Now, a lot's been written about Edo in terms of the physical geography. The land had to be drained and cleared. The port facilities were set up. Enormous activities in terms of bringing in food and water, taking out rubbish and excrement. And these are logistics of a city which are very interesting to think about. But as an art historian, I wanted to write a book about something a little different, and I tried to encapsulate what I was going to say under these two words of power and magic. And to do that, I put together 6 chapters and one little epilogue in which I talk about the creation of Tokyo, how it happened and why. And I haven't got time, of course, today to lead you through all 6 parts, but I very much hope some of you will be inspired by my talk, or not at any rate put off by my talk, from pursuing your interests in the history of Edo, and even buying the book and reading the other elements that I can't cover today in your own spare time. But I would like to cover today parts of chapters 1 and 2, since they set the scene best. Chapter 3, I'll talk a little bit about that today, Sacralizing space. I won't talk at all about Edo Castle, which of course doesn't exist today anymore, although the Imperial Palace is on the spot. Edo's poetic presence, there's a lot of poetry written about Edo. And then finally, a trip to the Yoshiwara. That was the pleasure district. I'm sure many of you know, and perhaps even collect, Japanese woodblock prints, which are very largely about the Yoshiwara, the place of nighttime distractions. But today I won't talk about that. So looking at the list of chapters, you can see, of course, I couldn't cover in the book, I certainly can't cover tonight the entire history of Edo, but I tried to think of it in a new sort of light, not looking at, as I said, the logistics of urban management, but at the way the city had a kind of intellectual space in the lives of the people that lived there. So let me begin. Edo was not much in medieval times, and that's a little bit surprising, because after all, Japan is very, very mountainous, and wherever you get an open space that could potentially support a population, there is almost always a population living there. The area around, I'll call it Edo from now on, you obviously know that means Tokyo. The area around Edo certainly has yielded archaeological evidence. So people did live here, even from Jomon times. I mean, thousands BC, people lived here, but it never grew into a big city. And the reason for that is likely to have been the seismic instability of the place. Edo is subject to repeated earthquakes, and over history, people would have discovered that what you built here fell down. And until population became very dense and you needed all space, don't settle in Edo, go somewhere else, Shizuoka or Sendai, and these are places, older, bigger towns. But there was a little bit of a castle, and the entire 16th century, Japan was at civil war, so almost every hill had a little castle built on it. And you can see on this slide, I hope you can see my cursor here, this is the castle of Edo, which was there for the whole 16th century, although to call it a castle gives the wrong kind of impression. It wasn't like Dover Castle or the Red Fort in India. It was a pretty paltry little place, but it did look over the river and over Edo Bay. The bay, of course, led you out to the sea. It was the arrival of Tokugawa Ieyasu, one of the warlords of the 16th century, into this place in 1590 that really begins the proper history of Edo. Ieyasu came to destroy a local warlord family. Of course, they didn't live in Edo because Edo was not important. They lived in Odawara, and the family were called the Hojo. And when Ieyasu destroyed them, everyone assumed he would set up his own area. He was a warlord, he wasn't more than that, but he would rule from Odawara. But he decided not to, and to everyone's surprise, he rebuilt the castle in Edo, much grander. He built all kinds of facilities to support a city. And people have wondered why he would choose to do that. There would be several reasons, but if you think 1590, I'm sure you're all familiar with European history and the history of Portuguese and Spanish expansion. 1590s is the era of the great explorations. The Portuguese had already taken much of Brazil, right, modern Brazil. The Spanish already had Mexico, and they already had the Philippines. So there are ships going around. Japan both wanted to take advantage of international trade, get rich by it, but they also were very concerned. And being on the sea, but in a bay, Edo potentially could absorb trade without being too exposed to Spanish and Portuguese guns. So that's probably accounts for Ieyasu's desire to remain here. But then in 1600, a decade after he arrived, he fought another battle, and this was one of the greatest battles in Japanese history, the Battle of Sekigahara. And it was really cataclysmic. Almost all the warlords of Japan lined up on one side or another. The sides are pretty evenly matched until half of one side switched over and joined Ieyasu. Don't ever fall for these silly stories about the way of the samurai's death. The samurai only started saying the way of the samurai's death when peace had come. During the period of Japan's wars, they backstab and double cross just the same as any warriors anywhere. So Ieyasu won thanks to stupendous miscreancy on the part of his enemy. And this gave rise to a kind of what's often referred to as a origins amnesia in the Tokugawa. They didn't want to talk about how they came to power, but it was all a bit shady. At any rate, having won that battle, Ieyasu had to decide what to do next. And he decided to require the emperor, who couldn't really say no, but he required the emperor to nominate him to the title of shogun. And this again was not obvious. The previous recent warlords had not opted for the title of shogun. They'd taken other ranks, or they had just simply scorned the court and they were kind of just themselves. But Ieyasu decided to ask the emperor, tell the emperor, to make him shogun, which was a rank which had been defunct for about 20 or 30 years, but had had no political power for almost a century during the civil wars. There was a shogun, but nobody listened to a word he said. But nevertheless, shoguns had dominated Japanese history for many hundreds of years, and he decides to become shogun. And he does in 1603. And again, everyone thought, well, shoguns, of course, rule from Kyoto, so he will go and build his shogunate there. But again, he decided not to. He remained in Edo, to the great surprise of many people. Likely, again, this is related to international trade, given that Kyoto is inland, it's not a port. You couldn't possibly, of course, you can get goods over land, but you can't get big ships docking there. Probably this is the reason. So Edo grew. And sorry, this slide's a bit fuzzy, but you can see here about a little bit after the death of Ieyasu, his son is ruling, say 1620 or so. Edo has become much bigger. Port wharf facilities have been made, a lot of land has been reclaimed, and moats have been dug, both to protect the castle against invasion, but also to protect it and the city against fire. The big problem with earthquakes is not so much that the building falls on you. After all, Japanese buildings are wood. They may fall on you and you can still be saved. It's not like brick or stone falling on you, but earthquakes cause fire. So you always need to be close to water sources. And the third reason for the moats is that they drained what was a rather swampy area. The map is color-coded, and it tells you on the bottom right, if you can read it despite it's fuzzy, that the orange is the military districts, the samurai districts, and of course that includes the castle in the center of the moats, and the red is the commoners. So the commoners are squeezed into a much smaller area. At the beginning, they may have been numerically fewer, but of course the commoner population expanded with the arrival of peace, the end of the civil wars, as the 17th century progressed. I'll come back to these in a second, but you can see that there's also some purple bits, and the purple bits are the religious institutions. Now, it's worth pointing out that Japan at this time was a Buddhist country. Today, officially speaking, the Japanese state is secular, but if it does anything, it does things with Shinto. Shinto really is a 19th century invention. Throughout the whole Edo period, Shinto is effectively a subordinate element within Buddhism. So Shinto rituals are performed by Buddhist monks, and most Shinto shrines are parts of Buddhist temples. There are exceptions. It's a complicated thing, but for now, that is, I think, a reasonable overview of the situation. Anyway, what you can see is that, of course, there are temples dotted about. And if I show you one further slide, this is Edo at the end of the Edo period, 1868. The regime fell and the government, the royal family, were put on the throne as modern Western style kings called emperors, as they remain today. So say 1860 or so, the end of the Edo period, you can see how the city has grown. It's crossed over the river. It's absorbed much more land back from the sea. The samurai bits, the orange bits, have spread over the hills as peace comes, and important warlords don't so much worry about fighting, but they want beautiful parks and gardens and country mansions. The commoner area has also expanded, though not so much, and commoners were living in very constricted space. The purple religious institutions have also expanded, and you can see particularly two here. Now, this map, don't ask me why, is kind of orientated towards, well, I suppose the map is leading you. This is the road that goes to Kyoto, so that's why they've done it that way. But this is the north, right? That's the north. So this is the northeast. And let me begin by explaining that. If you go back to the first slide, you can see that even before Edo really became an important place, there was a temple here. And this was a very old temple. Even though Edo was not an important spot, it had a temple, pretty much everywhere did. And when Ieyasu arrived in Edo, and he was still a warrior fighting people, he used to go to this temple to pray for success. And he almost always won his battles. So he concluded that the icon housed within this temple was a wonder-working and a very venerable one. And of course, he patronized the temple. So Edo, you can see it's bigger, although it's outside the city itself. Later on here, it would be within the temple. Now, that original temple, there it is, you can see that they built another one fairly close to it. And there is a clear reason for this. Now, this is the northeast viewed from the castle. According to geomancy, the magic of the earth, very important in East Asian thought, often in English it's known by the Chinese name as fengshui, or sometimes it's known as yin-yang divination. But let's call it geomancy, that's the English word. According to geomancy, the world has spiritual forces, which are invisible and they move through the world. And these spiritual forces are themselves inert and neutral, but they absorb what they pass over. So if spiritual force passes over an execution ground, the home of a traitor, or bad places, then it will become polluted, and the thing that the spiritual force next passes over will be polluted in turn. Therefore, you need to make sure that spiritual forces pass over good things before they get to you. And it was further believed that spiritual forces tended to move from northeast to southwest. So the primary stipulation of geomancy is protect the northeast, and that applied to temples, but it applied to anywhere else too. So you should have in your home something in the northeast. And if any of you live in traditional Japanese houses, you will know that traditional Japanese houses almost always face south, which means the back right-hand side of the house will be the northeast, and that is where you would normally have your tokonoma, right? Your family display, a beautiful painting, maybe a photograph of your grandmother, a little icon, some flowers to purify spiritual force coming in. So the Tokugawa at the very beginning of the period accepted this old temple as guarding their city. But it's not really to the northeast, it's more like to the east. So as Edo stabilized, the shoguns realized that they needed a more proper, formalized kind of temple in the northeast, and so they built a new one next to it. Now, temples in the northeast to protect a city go back to Nara, right? Japan's not quite first capital, but almost first capital, and furthermore, Kyoto. Now, the protective temples to the northeast of both Nara and Kyoto are on hills, and so it's assumed that a temple guarding a city should be on a hill. Furthermore, the temple associated with protecting Kyoto has a particular icon inside it, an icon of the medicine Buddha, one of many Buddhas. And the old temple that already existed, the Ieyasu prayed to, did not have a medicine Buddha, it had a different icon. So the new temple is built to be properly in the northeast and to house a proper icon that will effectively sacralize Edo by analogy with the sacralization of Kyoto. And let's just take a little look at those two temples. You can see that over time, they became so big that they virtually, literally bracketed 1/4 circle. The whole of the northeast of Edo was protected by them. And beyond that swathe of purification were positioned things which were dirty because they would pollute spiritual forces, but the spiritual force would then be re-purified by the temples. All cities need things which are impure, they would have said. For example, the slaughterhouses for animals, the execution grounds for criminals, the accommodations, the homes of the untouchable people that have to perform those tasks, and also the red light district. So the Yoshiwara pleasure district, which I told you I won't talk about today, is this little square here, right? Beyond the temples. Well, let's take a look at those two temples in the northeast. Many of you have been to the old one down by the river, which was called the Asakusa Kannon. Asakusa was just simply the name of the place, just outside Edo, a little village. And Kannon is the particular divinity enshrined there. And if you write Asakusa in Chinese style, the pronunciation comes out as sensor, and ji means a temple. So temples normally have Chinese style names. So Sensoji is the official name, Asakusa Kannon is the common name. But if you see this from a much later guidebook, it shows the temple teeming with people, commoners coming in to pray for money and their toothache to be cured and their daughter to marry somebody rich and powerful, and their son to get his finger out and such things. You see there's a pagoda here, a gate. Note Shinto shrines here within the temple grounds, and as often happens in Japan, the different temple buildings are specifically different buildings, right? In a Christian church, you just build a chapel on the side, but that's because you build in stone. In Japan, always frightened of fires, so keep the building separate, and if one burns down, hopefully you can save the others. So this is the old temple. When the government built the new one to be properly more to the northeast, they handed this old temple over to popular devotions, which is why even today the Asakusa Kannon is a very demotic kind of place with drinking all around it, and it's a very shitamachi sort of charming feel. The temple they built to protect the northeast then became the government temple, and that same guidebook here shows this very differently. You have here a vast but rather quiet processional entry with some lordly retinue here with halberds indicating this is a senior person who's coming in, and the whole temple itself is covered by clouds. Right? It's an interesting feature of a Japanese artistic practice, in fact, East Asian artistic practice, that you don't show elite things to common people. Right? Commoners might spit on them, or even if they don't, they at least are looking at them, and power does not like to be scrutinized in East Asian thought. So it's a guidebook to the city. They can't leave out an important temple, but they depict it and then cover it with clouds. This is a very common thing in Japanese artistic practice. The townspeople's houses outside the temple are open and not covered by clouds at all. This new temple was called the Kang-eiji. It's still there, although today it's become rather small. Most of its grounds were taken over by Ueno Park and Zoo and the national museums that are there, added, of course, in more modern times. Kang-e is an interesting name for a temple. It's the era name in which the temple was built, the 1830s, in fact. It's very, very uncommon in Japan to name temples after the era of their foundation. Temples are almost always called after some theological thing, the temple of the pure Dharma or the temple of the blue lotus or things like that. The reason this is called after its era of foundation is because the temple that protects the northeast of Kyoto is also named after the era of its foundation, right back in the 8th century. So again, this is being copied from that. And the temple that guards Kyoto is on a mountain called Mount Hiei. And so the little hill this one is on in Edo got named Eastern Mount Hiei. So again, the new city of Edo is being sacralized and venerated and made august by references to the sacred topography of Kyoto. Inside this Kang-eiji, the government temple, were actually built certain buildings to specifically refer to the history of Japanese piety. One was the Kiyomizu-do. Now, many of you have probably seen this because it's still standing there in Ueno Park, although it's been relocated. It's not in its original site, but the building is still there. You probably know very well that one of the most beautiful and famous and wonder-working temples in Kyoto is the Kiyomizu-dera. So there is the Kiyomizu-dera in Kyoto. It's recognizable by the fact it's built out over the hillside on a kind of gantry of woodwork, and so the Edo one makes a clear reference to it. Right? Of course, it's not so high. It's not trying to supplant the thing in Kyoto. It's trying to borrow its aura. And being a single building within the temple of Kang-eiji, it's not called the Kiyomizu-dera, which would indicate it's a temple in its own right. It's called the Kiyomizu-do, the Kiyomizu hall within the temple. And to go back to this slide, you can see there it is on the right-hand side with people looking out, and they look out over the Shinobazu Pond. Right? Again, many of you know this because you've been there. Shinobazu Pond also was artificially dug. It's not a natural pond. It was artificially dug in order to match the lake that stands to the northeast of Kyoto. That's to say Lake Biwa, right? Lake Biwa, the biggest freshwater lake in Japan, very important in Japanese history, also hugely important for communications. You get across to the Sea of Japan by sailing ships over the lake. And in the middle of Lake Biwa, there was a very, very important sacred spot called Chikubu Shima. And so when they build this pond in Edo, they build it in order to put in the middle of it a shrine. There you can see it there, replicating the one that is in Kyoto. And here's another example of it, a slightly later image. Because the pond is rather small, they built a causeway. You can walk across the water to it. In the Kyoto place, you've got to take a boat for a few hours to get there. So you see there is Edo being turned from just a warrior town far off in the fringes that has absolutely no history to it into something worthy and dignified, as great as Kyoto. Edo never became the capital until, of course, Meiji times when it became Tokyo. But for those of you that know Chinese characters, you can read Edo is simply written, door of the harbor. It kind of describes the place because it's on the bay. But you can also write Edo, can be written with the word character Higashi, meaning east. And Do can be written with the To of Kyoto. So then Edo can, as a kind of arrogant pun on behalf of the city, be rewritten to mean the metropolis in the east. And over the course of the Edo period, Edo grew to twice the size of Kyoto, and certainly it didn't look up to Kyoto very much. It thought it was better, but at the same time, of course, Kyoto does have history, and it also has the residence of the emperor. Now, the map that I showed you, which I thought I had repeated, but I didn't. Let me jump back to it. Sorry about this. You can see I just talked about the northeast, but as spiritual forces come into the city, they also leave. And if they come in from the northeast, they will leave from the southwest. So Edo was equipped also with two brand new temples in the southwest, and the same model was followed. One was for commoner use, and one was for government use. And the one for commoner use was called the Tokaiji, because it was right there on the Tokaido, the highway that leads you to Kyoto. If you're going to Kyoto, it's a long walk. You're all walkers, so maybe you've done it. I walked from Tokyo to Kyoto. It's almost exactly 2 weeks. It's not a strenuous walk, but it's a fairly long one. So you might well want to buy a lucky charm against illness or theft. You might want to buy some blessed sandals or chopstick to use along the way. Or if you've arrived into Edo from Kyoto, you probably want to give an offering of thanks. So this is a very popular, very much frequented temple. It's still there in Shinagawa area, although today it's very small. The other one used by the government, which is nearer in on this map, is the Zojoji. And of course, it's still there today, and its gateway, which is one of the oldest buildings still surviving in Tokyo from the, about 1630, is a very wonderful and grand thing to see. I've also given you that same gateway in a Edo period print on the right-hand side. So this protected the egress of spiritual forces outside the city and on into the countryside. You want to make sure that having passed over the city, then the temples re-purify before it runs off into the country. Now, the Zojoji was needed for government operations because the Tokugawa family themselves were not affiliated with the type of Buddhism which was necessary in the northeastern temple, right? Following the model of Kyoto, the Northeast Temple had to affiliate with a kind of Buddhism called Tendai. But the Tokugawa family themselves belonged to a type of Buddhism called Pure Land. And so they needed a Pure Land temple, because where else were they going to put their family graves? So that's what this temple is. It's their family one, and it has, of course, an icon inside it. All temples have a principal icon, and this one has an icon of very special interest. It's inside that, of course, now post-war shrine. Standing in front of it is a stand-in icon because it's a bit sad to go there and the icon is closed off. But Japan has many of these hidden Buddhas, so sacred that they can't be seen or can't be seen very often. And this one inside the Zojoji is known as the black icon because it's either was made of black wood or maybe it's just gone black over the centuries. The black icon, it's only shown 3 times a year, and one of the 3 times was last Saturday. So I was there last Saturday seeing it. There's wonderful rituals taking place in front of it, and in order to attend the ritual, they force you to buy an ofuda, what do you call it in English? A charm, the cheapest of one. I got the cheapest one. It's still 5,000 yen. The most expensive are Juma yen. Right, so you can spend what you're called your budget. But this is a very important icon. It's actually very, very old, so it's important in its own right as a kind of artwork. But more importantly, this was the icon that Tokugawa Ieyasu himself used when he went off on campaigns. Right, the icon in the in the Sensoji Asakusa, I told you he prayed to it, but he couldn't walk off with it on campaigns. The monks wouldn't let him. So he had his own wonderful icon he took with him. And this black icon, on one amazing occasion, when Ieyasu was fighting a battle and not doing very well, it looked like he might even be captured or killed. Suddenly, they found a warrior wearing black clothes, fighting very valiantly, killing scores of people without taking any wounds. And at the end of the battle, Ieyasu asked his generals, who was that warrior? I've never seen him. Thanks to him, we turned the battle in our favor. And all the generals said, we've no idea who he was. We've never seen him before. So Ieyasu went back to his camp and he opened his shrine to thank his Buddha for victory, and he discovered the icon was not there. The icon was that warrior, right? This icon fought for the Tokugawa. And of course, it means that the Tokugawa victories were sacred victories. They weren't just the result of Tokugawa being stronger, they were the result of the Buddhists themselves fighting on their side. And of course, this was a hugely powerful and important legend, we would say, fact, they would have said. So that's why it's so holy, it can't be seen very often. So that's sort of the first half of what I want to talk to you about today, the layout of Edo in terms of its sacred spaces. But there's a second point I also wanted to make. Back to this map again. I've just told you there, Zojoji, I didn't show you, but there is the Tokaiji. But there's one other spot which I'd like to spend about 10 minutes time I think I have left to me to talk about. No more temples, let's think about something secular. Edo was drained by moats and a kind of spiral of moats, and the main area in which they empty into the river that takes them out is right here, right? This is the kind of external moat, but the main one, as you can see from the castle itself, comes out here, and it's also this canal thing here, pretty much due east-west. 2 roads that come into Edo and carry on as Edo's main cross-town highway goes out and continues to the Tokaido and onto Kyoto. Those 2 roads come together and cross that moat right there. This little spot became very significant. Ieyasu, or perhaps one of his advisors, had a very interesting idea. Now, most important towns in Japanese history, certainly grand ones of the kind where a shogun would live, should be grids. Of course, Kyoto is a grid, remains a grid. Nara was a grid, it isn't very much anymore. But and so Edo ought to be a grid. But it's too dangerous to have a grid. when there is still the remnants of civil war going on. So Edo was not a grid. That meant it seemed a bit haphazard and not very grand and proper in the Japanese way of thinking. And so Ieyasu, or one of his advisors' brilliant idea, was to say, let's create a city center. Grids, of course, by definition, can't have a center. Kyoto has no center. It's all focused on the palace, which is in the north, not in the center. So somebody said, let's give Edo a center. No Japanese city had ever had one before. In fact, no East Asian city had ever had a center before. Where on earth did they get this idea from? Well, all European cities have centers. Certainly the grand ones do. Rome, obviously. Later cities, London acquired Trafalgar Square later on. Paris acquired Place de la Concorde. These are it's normal practice going back to Greece and Rome to have a kind of forum in the center. And at this period, 1600, there are loads of Spanish and Portuguese wandering around Japan. Many of them are Christian priests who have trained in Rome or in Naples or in Antwerp, or the grand cities of Europe. So they knew all about urban planning. And although there's no document saying it, it would appear to be the fact that in seeking to deal with how you make Edo grand, but at the same time you can't make it grand under Japanese expectations of a grid, what do you do? Somebody's alighted on this idea. However, the center of Edo was a bridge across this moat. It wasn't a square, again, probably because it's too dangerous to have a big wide open square when you're still frightened of civil war. And so Edo was centered on a bridge. We have no image of it from that early, well, not very clear images from the early time. So I'm showing you a much later one by Hokusai, where we see the bridge and another bridge added on later on. It wasn't there in early times. In the early times, you would stand on this bridge and you would look due west towards Edo Castle. You would see the castle. It was a very grand established vista, but you couldn't walk down it because it's a canal. So it's another way of making this kind of thing that Western cities have, where you have a grand view down onto the palace. Think of the Mile in London. But it's too dangerous to have an actual road leading to the palace, given that civil war is still rumbling around. So they make it an inaccessible view. And the bridge, which was the center of Edo, was called the Bridge of Two Carriageways. It was so wide, people could cross it in both directions at the same time. And think of this fact about bridges, that bridges are the first things that suffer during warfare, right? Bridges allow troops to move around. And I happen to come from London, and of course we all are brought up on the song, London Bridge is Falling Down. London Bridge did not fall down. London Bridge was deliberately destroyed by the city of London as a last, citizens of London, as a last desperate attempt before their city was attacked by the Danes, right? And it was so traumatic to destroy the bridge that they continue to sing about it 1,000 years later, right? So if warfare is the beginning of destruction of bridges, then peace is the recreation of bridges or the building of bridges. Of course, bridge building as a metaphor survives today as overcoming chaos and dispute and the return of peace. And in Japanese thought, interestingly enough, many bridges in Japan that existed historically were attributed to monks. Almost all bridges are said to have been built by monks as an act of piety, because of course they allow people to get across, people and goods to get across rivers without being swept away or frozen in winter, or risk losing your goods in a trip you trip over or something. So but also the building of bridges is in Buddhist thought a metaphor. The attainment of enlightenment is often said to be reaching the further shore. We're all trying to reach the further shore, but we don't know how to get there. A bridge takes you to the further shore. Right? It is the metaphor for the attainment of enlightenment. And so for the shogun to give a bridge to indicate the center of his city is about peace, yes, but also some theological notion of what a shogunate does for the people. It has a sacred dimension. It's also worth pointing out that those priests I mentioned who were wandering around Japan at this time, we call them priests, but they use Latin. And in Latin, a Christian priest is called a pontifex, right? Literally a builder of bridges. So there may well be a Christian input into this construction too. Christianity at this time was still completely legal in Japan, right? It would have been made illegal in 1614. So there we have the center of Edo. Centers are likely to have important things placed around them. And indeed, the Tokugawa placed around this two-track bridge several important institutions. But one thing I got ahead of myself, so let me go back. I told you it's called the two-track bridge, right? So why? Nobody had ever seen such a beautiful wide bridge before. But Japanese language is full of puns, and often people deliberately make puns, say two things at the same time. The word for two-track is nihon, nihon. But of course, nihon also means Japan. So this is both the bridge of two carriageways and the bridge of Japan. It is the center of the entire realm, not Kyoto, but now Edo. What Hokusai shows us very clearly in this image from a later guidebook, 2-page spread, that's why there's a line down the middle, is the fish market. Fish market. Now, people think of fish as being typical Japanese food, and people think of sushi as being typical Japanese food, but it is absolutely not typical Japanese food. Fish and sushi is Edo food. Proper sushi is called edomai, right? Come from Edo. Kyoto people don't eat much fish because they're not a port. You might get river fish. You certainly wouldn't dream of eating sushi in Kyoto because it can't possibly be fresh enough. So that fish eating and therefore plenty of protein is a feature of Edo because you are close to the shogun, right? Coming close to authority, bestows bounty on everyone. So there is the fish market very clearly seen. But there are three other institutions that were gathered at Nihonbashi, the bridge of Japan. One was the embassy of the Dutch East India Company. Now, the only entity with which Japan has formal and ongoing international relations at this time is the Dutch East India Company. They had intermittent relationships with the kings of Korea and the kings of Ryukyu, now taken over as Okinawa. But the Dutch came almost every year throughout the whole Edo period, and they lived in this compound called the Nagasaki House, of which we have very few depictions because being a government institution, people didn't think that they should make pictures of it. So these are only two, and they're very late in the Edo period. You see the Dutch people inside with their red hair, but they were positioned right there at Nihonbashi. The second important thing gathered there was the time bell. When Edo becomes a codified and solidified and important city, you need the control of time. And the control of time was the shogun's gift. Think to yourself in the cities that you know, or the countries that you know, who controls time? And again, in the case of London, it is Parliament, right? Big Ben. The Queen does not control time. The Church does not control time. Parliament. And that is very key in English thinking about their own sovereignty, right? Which of course is much perplexing in English just at present. In other countries, the main clock will be on the royal palace or on the church. In Japan, the main clock, or rather time bell, was at Nihonbashi, and it was the shogun's gift. And a few times in the course of the Edo period, the area burnt down and the bell was lost to fire. But each time a new one was donated by the shogun, and here we have the last one. This is from the early 18th century, donated by the shogun. Obviously today it's put inside some rather unsightly concrete bunker, and it's moved into a local park. It's not quite at Nihonbashi today, and sadly this park is now much frequented by rough sleepers. So you can see a gentleman there who's having a kip underneath the time bell. I waited for him to go, but he wasn't moving anywhere fast, so I just took the photograph of him there anyway. And the third important element at Nihonbashi was the mint. Now, from almost all Japanese history, the Japanese government has not issued currency. It's very different from Islamic or European countries where the issuing of currency is a fundamental act of government. Most times in Japan, you used Chinese money, perfectly reasonable, why not? Or you simply weighed out precious metal. Japan had silver and gold mines, so you had little nuggets, and some official lender who you trusted would deal. Of course, not lots of people just worked on barter anyway. But with the beginning of the Edo period, and again, it might again be under European influence, Japan creates a mint. And there it is. It was such an important government building. It was never, ever, ever depicted. But Hokusai shows it here with gold roofs, right? This is where all the money is. So he's kind of indicating this with 3 gold roofs. The Bank of Japan is still on the spot. So the Bank of Japan has not moved since about 1610. And with these 4 elements, we have the provision of food, the fish market. We have the shogun's command of space. He can bring people even from the furthest ends of the world, Holland, to honor him and give him presents. We have the control of time in the time bell, and we have the control of value in the issuing of currency. And this is all gathered around Nihonbashi, the Bridge of Japan, the bridge of 2 carriageways. But the last thing to say, if you stood on that bridge and looked towards the castle and knew about these spots, you would see one other thing, and that is Mount Fuji. There it is, very clearly shown, rising above even Edo Castle. And Edo's great claim to fame, and my chapter about poetry in Edo, a lot of it is to do with Japan's most magnificent mountain, is the protector, the sacralizer of Edo. And in another pun, Fuji means not two, right? Fu means not, and ji or ni means two. So Fuji is unique, single, unitary. They don't have one in Kyoto, and they don't have one in China. So here is Edo leading, right? In many ways, Edo had to defer to Kyoto. It was older. And much Japanese culture defers to classical civilizations coming from China. It's just the same with, look at England, Britain. It's all, most things are better in France and Germany, and culture comes from France and Italy and Germany anyway, right? But here in the form of Mount Fuji, Japan has its own internal, unique and blessed legitimation. So that's the end of my talk. It's just after 10:02, but I think we started a few minutes late. So I'd be very happy to answer questions, but Giorgio is in charge of the Q&A. So back to you, Giorgio.
Thank you, Tim, for such a wonderful talk. It's pretty amazing that we walk around Tokyo, Edo, and we don't really see at first what's lingering behind the modern structure and buildings. So we had a number of questions, excuse me, earlier. Somebody was asking if the view of Edo Bridge was east to west, but I think you've answered that in your talk. And,
yeah.
And so, aside from that, there's no more questions. So, other than Zojoji, what are some of the oldest buildings in the city in Tokyo that have that are now still standing?
So the Zojoji, as well as having the Great Gateway, has a library. Right, and in many Japanese libraries, they're a kind of huge revolving bookcase. It's inside a building, and today it's inside a concrete building to protect it. But that library is still there. It's hardly ever open to the public. The Zojoji also has several shogunal graves, but they were much damaged during the Second World War, so not a whole lot to look at there. Otherwise, there is the Kiyomizu door, replicating the one in Edo, in Kyoto, still there to be seen in the park, the Ueno Park. Then there is also the Toshogu in Ueno Park. Now, obviously, you all know that Ieyasu was buried at Nikko, and his deified form was called the Tosho avatar, and so his shrine was called the Tosho Gu. But it's hard to get to Nikko, and the shogun needed to do all kinds of rituals for his ancestral graves. So there was a beautiful Tosho Gu also built at Kangeiji, part of the purification of the Northeast. So that building is still there to be seen as well. Otherwise, unless I've left something out, that's about all you're going to find in terms of early 17th century buildings in Tokyo today. There are, of course, surprising number of early Meiji period buildings that survive. Quite amazing how many, considering the Second World War and also the Great Kanto earthquake.
Yeah, thank you. So one more question. Somebody's asking why, when the Meiji Restoration happened and the power shifted back to the imperial family, why wasn't the capital moved back to Kyoto?
Yeah. Well, I mean, not moved back, of course, because Kyoto remained the capital throughout the other period. It was debated, but at that point, once again, it's an issue of international shipping, because the well, of course, the Americans, Perry and people is well known, but Americans weren't the only ones turning up in big ships, and a big ship can't get through the inland sea anywhere approaching Osaka or Kyoto. So they decided to move up here, but initially they were intended to have two capitals. So some countries do have two capitals, right? Russia has both St. Petersburg and Moscow, and Holland has both Amsterdam and The Hague. So Japan was going to have two, and Kyoto was going to be called Saikyo, the capital in the west, and Edo was going to actually be called Torquay, not Tokyo. Tokyo is a later decision to pronounce it that way, Torquay. But in the end, the Kyoto people didn't like to be called Saikyo, so they just got Kyoto, and Edo got to be called Tokyo. It also benefited the fact that it's near enough to ocean-going ports, but a big ship can't get right into Edo Bay, so they remained free from the risk of American or Russian or British or Swedish gunships coming in. But very rapidly, of course, a railway line was built down to Osaka, which became the main port.
Thank you. One more question. So is there any reason that evil comes from the Northeast? You mentioned earlier in the talk when we were talking about geomancy.
Yes. By the time these theories get to Japan, it's purely kind of conceptual. Oh. But it's likely that when these theories were first developed in China, that genuine, real danger came from the Northeast. You know, there were Mongols up there and Manchus and things. So probably in China, it was based on actualities, but in Japan, it becomes theoretical. And of course, in the case of Edo, if Edo was ever going to be attacked, which it wasn't, but if it was ever going to be attacked, likely the attack would come actually up from the Kyoto area. Yeah. So the southwest, and that's, I didn't mention it in the lecture, but that's the reason why you get this second set of temples in the southwest, which Kyoto does not have. Kyoto only protects the northeast, and most cities only protect the northeast, but Edo is paying reference to the fact that there may well be a genuine attack, and so they put sacred protection in that direction too.
Of course. One question from Judy. You mentioned that there were two roads where when Nihonbashi crosses, and you mentioned one was is the Tokaido. What was the other one? I could answer this, but
the other one is the becomes the Nikko Kaido.
Nikko Kaido.
So that you go to Nikko with it. Although when the bridge was first built, Nikko had not yet become a Tokugawa sacred site. So, but anyway, that road goes generally off into the Tohoku area.
And there's also the Nakasendo, of course.
Yes. So all the highways officially begin at Nihonbashi.
Right.
But only the Nikko one and the Tokaido, you literally walk directly down that road. The Nakasendo and other ones, you have to kind of weave your way through little city streets until you get to the city fringe. In fact, if I go back to that map, you can see how the other right, they come in and then it stop for protective reasons. But technically speaking, all these roads begin at Nihonbashi. It is the bridge of Japan. It's where all roads lead to or go from.
Thank you. One more question. This is a personal question about your favorite spots in the city, in Tokyo.
I first lived in Tokyo in Meguro. And so Meguro down here, the Shinagawa River, right? The Shinagawa Gawa. And Meguro is about here, which was always on the fringe. There's a big temple there. And so I used to love walking around there. Meguro has a big temple called the Fudodo, the temple to Fudo, and also has a very other wonderful temple that was moved to that site in Meiji times. So Unedo was not, in fact, it's here, the temple of the Gohyaku Rakanji, the temple of the 500 Arhats. And those are two of my favorite places. So I love to wander around that area. But of course, also the Asakusa and Ueno area are also very, very exciting places to go.
Thank you. One more question is, after the Black Buddha went missing, was it later replaced by the current Buddha?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't finish the story. It returned to its shrine later on, which is why, yes, it's why it became available after Ieyasu's death for enshrinement in the temple. But a lot of these hidden Buddhas, because they're only shown so rarely and people turn up and they want to see something, you get a kind of subsidiary standing in front. The subsidiary may be a replica of the one inside, so you still have the effect of seeing it. It's not the real one, or it might be a completely different image.
Thank you. There's one last question. In Tokyo, as we see today, there are many modern buildings, and the two of them are mentioned as the Tokyo Tower and the Sky Tree. Do you know if they hold any cultural or historical significance?
The sites or the actual buildings?
The actual buildings. Or the site, actually, it's not specified, so we could answer both.
The site of the Tokyo Tower is right there on the Zojoji. These big government temples, because when Meiji came along, they were very unhappy with Tokugawa sacralization, obviously. So they did all they could to remove it. And a lot of government temples lost a lot of their land. Of course, Meiji also extracted horrendous persecutions on Buddhism. And Meiji is today called a restoration, but it really was a cultural revolution. So many temples lost most of their ground, and then other things put on them. So but by the 1960s, when the Tokyo Tower was built, it was available for whatever you want. Of course, the Prince Hotel is there as well now. The location of the Sky Tree, I don't know. Of course, it is in the northeast. But whether that was part of anyone's thinking at the time it was put together, I don't know. But one thing said about the Sky Tree, this is completely coincidence, but it is true, is that if you go to Ieyasu's grave at Nikko, of course, there is the torii to enter it, a magnificent early 17th century stone torii, and the lintel of the torii is exactly the same height.
Right, the same height, that's right.
Sky Tree. But I think that's chance. I don't know. Someone must have discovered that along the way, and I don't even know if it's really true. But it certainly is what's said if you go there.
Yeah, that's true. I remember that we do go to Nikko on our Basho tour, and
Nikko, of course, is one of the most wonderful places to visit in all of Japan.
That's great. Thank you so much, Tim, for today's talk. As mentioned, we've answered all the questions, I think, and we're also coming up to our